96 million Americans, about 96 million Americans, or 40% of the U.S. total population, they're going to make a New Year's resolution this year. And some of these commitments are pretty traditional, right? In fact, in 2012, Harris Interactive Poll conducted a study of 3,036 U.S. adults and found that some of the New Year's resolutions, the top ones for the following year of 2013, would be weight loss, improving finance, exercise, getting a new job, eating healthier, managing stress, quitting smoking, a lot of very good commitments. But with 96 million Americans following this cultural tradition, I think it begs the question, where did this come from? How did it become so ubiquitous? What is the history of the New Year's resolution? Now, the history of a New Year's resolution isn't clean, right? It's not just a single timeline. The concept of a new year has sprouted up in so many different cultures that the New Year's resolution doesn't really have one single origin or history. But here are a couple of the major turning points for this tradition. 4,000 years ago, ancient Babylonian times in Mesopotamia, time was different back then. And I don't say time just like culture was different or food. No, I'm saying time itself was different back then. Like the way it was measured was different. A different calendar and a different beginning, a different reason to begin. You see, in the Babylonian calendar, the first month was called Nisanu. And I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that because I don't know a lot of things, but one thing I do know is that this month, this first month in the Babylonian calendar actually falls on what today would be considered March into April. And why March into April? Why this time period for the beginning of a year? In March and April is actually the planting season for barley. You see, crops were so important that in some ways, literally time itself began and revolved around crops. You know, in this era, there was a festival, one of the first New Year's celebrations that involved a New Year's resolution was the Akitu Festival. And it celebrated the planting of barley, and it celebrated the supreme god Marduk and his crown prince, some other gods. But what's important to the history of New Year's resolution, I guess to us today, is that this is where those promises started. Babylonians would actually make promises to the gods and actually take this as a resetting moment to return borrowed tools and supplies, equipment to their neighbors. You know, it was more of a trade economy back then, and so this would make sense for a reset. And for those promises, if they kept their words to the gods, well, great fortune would bestow them. So a new year starts with new life. A plant, a hope, a seed. But how do we get to January? How do we come about to January 1st? Well, January, and the concept of January, even as a word, started in 46 BC, where Julius Caesar has a problem. You see, in 46 BC, the average Roman citizen in the empire didn't know what day it was. Because of the vastness of the empire, there were so many pockets, and there were so many different civilizations and cities that it really involved a lot of different calendars, because time was measured differently, and people didn't know when celebrations were supposed to be the further and further you got away from the city. And so Julius Caesar in 46 BC decides to standardize on what is considered the Julian calendar, and they start with January. But this word, January, where does it come from? It's sourced from, the etymology of this word is from Janus, the god of new beginnings. How fitting for the new year. And if you see imagery of Janus, he is often depicted with having two faces, one looking backwards in time and one looking ahead into the future. And it's so symbolic to not only the Roman interpretation of time and a calendar, but certainly perhaps even a human reflection, that we look back on what we've accomplished, perhaps even our failures, and then we also look forward to new hope. As for New Year's resolutions themselves, well, Roman officials would actually make these pledges, these promises on January 1st, that date, to honor the emperor to show that loyalty. And at the citizen level, average everyday people would exchange fruit and honey, these gifts, and they would make these promises much to the gods as they did in ancient Mesopotamia. So important was this day that the courts actually closed for half of the day, so it was really considered a holiday for the Roman Empire. As the New Year's resolution continues to spread across the world, the Julian calendar is widely used, but certainly not the only one. And if we want to reflect on how we got to today, well, we actually follow in most of the world what's called the Gregorian calendar. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII standardized the calendar that is most widely used in society and across the world today. If you were to ask the average person, though, at least in America, what is one of the symbols that marks a new year, certainly the calendar is a piece of that, and understanding the history from an ancient perspective is something that is a curiosity, but I think most people would actually just think about Times Square and the ball drop. So let's look into that. Celebration in this area actually started in about 1904. There was a big celebration next to the Trinity Church near Wall Street, and this was something that was already established, but the New York Times, the actual newspaper that Times Square is named after, wanted to draw attention to their new building, the tallest building in New York City at the time. So in a promotional effort, they actually moved this celebration from near the Trinity Church to Times Square. And since 1907, the iconic ball has dropped from one Times Square building. Why a ball, though? Well, it's actually a time ball, which is a now obsolete time signaling device. Okay, so imagine back even in the 1800s, you're on a ship and you need to reset your clock in your time, right? There's no digital age at this point. You've got to kind of do this certainly manually. And as you're crossing a port, they would have a giant wooden ball that would drop at a certain time, usually around 1 p.m. And then you could sync your clock, your calendar, to that time and stay on course. The very first time ball in Times Square was actually over 700 pounds, made of wood and iron. It had 125 watt light bulbs on it, and there have been 7 different versions of this ball at Times Square. For 100 years, the ball has dropped, over 100 years. And it's worked every single time, except twice. 2 times the ball did not drop, and it was a voluntary reason. Those years were 1942 and 1943. Now remember, the time ball as a concept is to signal the time for sailors passing by. Well, Times Square being such a large building in New York City, it was kind of a beacon, kind of a lighthouse for passing ships. But in 1942 and 1943, they had this voluntary dim out of this light because they were afraid. Americans were afraid that there were German subs in the Atlantic Ocean. And so this was the only 2 years that the ball didn't drop in Times Square. That celebration continues into this year, and new traditions are created along the way. For example, Confetti Wish. Confetti Wish is something that happens in Times Square as well. You know, all the confetti drops, but prior to New Year's Eve in this celebration, they offer the ability for passerbys, visitors, tourists, people from New York City, the opportunity to write a wish, a hope, even a New Year's resolution on little pieces of confetti. Those wishes and hopes are put into over a ton, over 2,000 pounds of other confetti that would ultimately be dropped on New Year's Eve into New Year's Day. New Year's resolutions come with hope. It comes with the turning of a calendar. It comes with the concept that perhaps we can get better. That this marker, even if it is somewhat relative, right? That it is a man-made construct, whether it's in January or March and April or whenever the year starts, it at least gives us a point of reflection. And I think that's incredibly important about the New Year's resolution. And as we reflect, I think it's important to understand how we can get better by looking at some studies that have been done about the New Year's resolution itself. In 1989, distinguished professor Jonathan Norcross would do a study on New Year's resolutions specifically in America. You see, he put out this advertisement just on TV about just calling out to folks saying, hey, what is your New Year's resolution? And we want to kind of track the success of it and see how it goes. And because of this advertisement, over 300 respondents call into this line in 1989, and they begin to do a study, a survey of basically how successful people are in this pursuit of this goal. Participants were telephoned for structured interviews at 7 different intervals: 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and 2 years. At each interval, researchers solicited those resolvers, those folks who were making the resolutions. Just on a 4-point scale, they asked, how is it going? Have you totally failed, mostly succeeded, or totally succeeded? So there are 2 principal things that they discovered. Research findings suggested that someone is 10 times more likely to be successful by making a New Year's resolution than having the identical goal with similar motivations. That just being centered around this time would actually make it much more likely to succeed. What I think is more important than even that, even more important than a 10 times multiple, is that the people who reported that they did succeed, they also reported that they slipped up, that they failed, they made mistakes along the way on an average of 14 times in order to get to that success. In fact, 71% of the people who said they succeeded said that these slip-ups were actually important pieces to learn about themselves, important failures to adjust their plan and to get better in the pursuit of this goal. So as you look into the next year, as you contemplate a New Year's resolution or perhaps even a promise, I ask you to think about the thought of failure, that it may be a part of the history of your New Year's resolution. It may be part of the process of your new commitment. But maybe that's just part of what it takes. Maybe those failures can help us learn, as Jonathan Norcross's study suggests. And as you perhaps solidify this commitment, I challenge you to make a video blog once a week, once a day, for the entire year, to track your progress until that promise is committed, until it is actually completed. Because one of the benefits of the study is that Norcross did was the fact that somebody even called every week, 3 weeks, month, right? That's actually something that helps keep us focused. So perhaps a video blog could help you. Perhaps that can be part of the history of your New Year's resolution. I encourage you to share it with us, or maybe even just keep it private, but I encourage you to take the step to hold yourself accountable, because sometimes we need that. Don't get caught up too much in the hype. Remember that when it comes to time and a calendar, the beginning of a year is somewhat arbitrary. Whether it's March, whether it's January, sort of a man-made construct. What's most important, though, is that we take this energy and we use it. If it's going to be there, if we're going to think of this as a turning of the page, why not? Why not take that momentum and do something positive with it? We hope only the best for you, your New Year's resolution, your promises in the new year and every day.